What happens when Hollywood's most respected veteran meets late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. The tension that erupted last night has sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry, with Ford's explosive departure leaving audiences stunned and Kimmel's reputation hanging by a thread. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in the most dramatic late-night television meltdown we've ever witnessed. The stage was set for disaster. From the moment Harrison Ford walked onto Jimmy Kimmel's show, what should have been a standard appearance to promote his latest project quickly transformed into a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview. Ford, known for his no-nonsense approach to media appearances and his visible discomfort with typical Hollywood promotion tactics, entered the studio with his usual reserved demeanor. The legendary actor, who has weathered decades of interviews while maintaining his privacy and dignity, had no idea he was about to face the most disrespectful treatment of his illustrious career. Kimmel, notorious for his boundary-pushing humor and increasingly aggressive interview style, seemed determined to provoke a reaction from the notoriously private Ford. The host's opening monologue had already set an uncomfortable tone, featuring several pointed jokes about Ford's age and his supposed reluctance to engage with modern Hollywood culture. Audience members later reported sensing an unusual tension in the studio even before Ford made his entrance, with Kimmel's energy feeling more predatory than welcoming. The initial pleasantries felt forced and artificial as Ford settled into the guest chair. Kimmel's trademark grin seemed more menacing than friendly, and Ford's body language immediately conveyed his discomfort with the host's approach. The veteran actor, who has masterfully navigated countless interviews throughout his decades-long career, appeared visibly tense as Kimmel launched into his first line of questioning with an unusual level of aggression. "Harrison, you've been doing this for what, 50 years now?" Kimmel began, his tone carrying an undercurrent of condescension that immediately put Ford on edge. "At what point do you just admit you're too old for action movies?" The question landed like a slap, and Ford's jaw tightened noticeably. The audience, sensing the inappropriate nature of the opening, fell into an uncomfortable silence that spoke volumes about the host's miscalculation. Ford's response was measured but firm. "I think my work speaks for itself, Jimmy. Age brings experience and wisdom that younger actors simply haven't had time to develop." His voice carried the weight of someone who had earned respect through decades of dedication to his craft. But Kimmel seemed completely oblivious to the warning signs. Rather than backing down or shifting to more respectful territory, Kimmel doubled down with even more personal attacks disguised as humor. "But come on, Harrison. You've got to admit, watching you run in the latest Indiana Jones was like watching my grandfather chase the ice cream truck." The host's cackle echoed through the studio as Ford's expression darkened considerably. This wasn't playful banter between colleagues. This was a deliberate attempt to humiliate one of cinema's most beloved figures. The veteran actor's professionalism was being tested to its absolute limits, as Kimmel continued his relentless assault on Ford's dignity. "I mean, at your age, shouldn't you be thinking about retirement homes rather than saving the world?" Kimmel pressed, seemingly feeding off the visible discomfort he was causing his guest. Ford's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles whitening as he struggled to maintain his composure in the face of such blatant disrespect. What made the situation even more troubling was Kimmel's apparent enjoyment of Ford's discomfort. The host's eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction as he watched the legendary actor struggle to process the unprecedented level of unprofessionalism he was encountering. This wasn't the respectful discourse that Ford had experienced with countless other interviewers throughout his career. This was something far more sinister and deliberately cruel. The audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats as the interview took on an increasingly hostile tone. Many longtime viewers of the show later reported that they had never witnessed Kimmel display such obvious contempt for a guest, particularly one of Ford's stature and reputation. The host seemed to be operating under the mistaken belief that his behavior was entertaining, rather than deeply inappropriate and disrespectful. Ford's attempts to redirect the conversation toward his work were consistently thwarted by Kimmel's determination to focus on personal attacks and age-related mockery. Every time the actor tried to discuss his craft or current projects, the host would interrupt with another cutting remark, designed to diminish and embarrass his guest. The pattern was becoming clear. Kimmel had no interest in conducting a legitimate interview, and was instead using Ford as a target for his increasingly cruel brand of humor. The breaking point was rapidly approaching, as Ford's patience wore dangerously thin, and Kimmel seemed completely unaware that he was about to push one of Hollywood's most respected figures past his absolute limit. The atmosphere in the studio had become suffocating, as Kimmel's relentless assault on Ford's dignity continued without mercy. The host, emboldened by what he mistakenly interpreted as Ford's passive acceptance of his abuse, decided to escalate his attacks to an even more personal level. What happened next would forever change the trajectory of both men's careers and expose the true character of late-night television's most controversial figure. "You know what I find really interesting, Harrison?" Kimmel leaned forward with a predatory smile, his voice dripping with false intimacy. "How you've managed to stay relevant when most actors your age are forgotten relics collecting dust in Hollywood nursing homes." The cruelty in his tone was unmistakable, and Ford's eyes flashed with barely contained fury. This wasn't just unprofessional behavior. It was a calculated attempt to destroy the dignity of a man who had dedicated his life to entertaining millions. Ford's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper as he responded, "I think you're confusing relevance with respect, Jimmy. Something you clearly know nothing about." The warning in his tone was crystal clear, but Kimmel seemed intoxicated by his own perceived power, and completely missed the signs that he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The host's laughter rang hollow through the studio as he prepared to deliver what he believed would be his masterstroke of humiliation. "Oh, respect? Is that what we're calling it when studios hire you out of nostalgia rather than talent?" Kimmel's words cut through the air like a blade, and the collective gasp from the audience was audible. Even his own production team began exchanging worried glances, recognizing that their host had ventured into territory that no professional interviewer should ever explore. Ford's composure finally began to crack, as decades of professionalism battled against his natural human instinct to defend himself against such blatant disrespect. His voice carried a tremor of controlled rage as he responded, "I've been in this business longer than you've been alive, Jimmy. I've earned my place through hard work and dedication, not by tearing down others to make myself feel important." The rebuke was delivered with the precision of a man who had reached his breaking point, but was still desperately trying to maintain some semblance of civility. But Kimmel, either too arrogant or too stupid to recognize the danger he was in, pressed forward with even more vicious attacks. "Hard work? Harrison, let's be honest here. You've been coasting on Indiana Jones and Han Solo for decades. When was the last time you actually acted instead of just showing up and collecting a paycheck?" The host's words were designed to wound, and they found their mark with devastating accuracy. The studio fell into an eerie silence as Ford's face transformed from controlled anger to something far more dangerous. His hands, which had been gripping the armrests of his chair, slowly released as he sat back, and fixed Kimmel with a stare that could have melted steel. The veteran actor's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of decades of experience, and the barely contained fury of a man who had been pushed beyond his limits. "You know what, Jimmy? I've sat through a lot of interviews with a lot of different hosts over the years. Some were good, some were bad. But I've never encountered someone who seemed to take such obvious pleasure in trying to humiliate their guests." Ford's words were measured and deliberate, each one carefully chosen for maximum impact. "What you're doing right now isn't entertainment. It's cruelty disguised as comedy. and it says everything about who you are as a person." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and for the first time since the interview began, Kimmel seemed to realize that he might have miscalculated. But rather than backing down or attempting to defuse the situation, the host's ego demanded that he double down on his aggressive approach. "Oh, come on, Harrison. Don't be so sensitive. This is comedy. This is what we do here. If you can't handle a little roasting, maybe you shouldn't be in show business." Ford's laugh was bitter and cold as he shook his head in disbelief. "A little roasting? Jimmy, you've spent the last 15 minutes systematically trying to tear down everything I've worked for my entire career. You've questioned my talent, my relevance, my worth as a human being, and you call it comedy?" The actor's voice was rising now, his legendary composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of Kimmel's relentless assault. The audience sat in stunned silence as they witnessed the systematic destruction of what should have been a respectful conversation between two professionals. Many viewers later reported feeling deeply uncomfortable watching Kimmel's behavior, describing it as watching a bully torture their victim for sport. The host's treatment of Ford wasn't just unprofessional, it was a masterclass in how to destroy decades of goodwill and respect in a matter of minutes. As the confrontation reached its crescendo, Ford's eyes blazed with righteous indignation as he prepared to deliver a response that would expose Kimmel's true character to the world. The veteran actor had reached his absolute breaking point, and what happened next would shock everyone. Ford leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet tone that somehow carried more power than any shout could have. "Mustard. You want to know what comedy is, Jimmy? Comedy is supposed to bring people together, make them laugh with joy, not tear them down for your own sick entertainment." His words cut through the studio like a knife, and suddenly Kimmel's confident smirk began to falter as he realized he was no longer in control of the situation. The host, perhaps sensing that he had pushed too far but unable to back down without losing face, made the fatal mistake of interrupting Ford mid-sentence. "Oh, please, Harrison, spare me the lecture about comedy from someone who hasn't been funny since the 80s. The words had barely left Kimmel's mouth when Ford's hand slammed down on the arm of his chair with such force that the entire studio seemed to shake. "Enough!" Ford's voice exploded through the studio with a power that made everyone present freeze in their seats. The legendary actor rose to his feet, towering over the suddenly diminished host, his face a mask of controlled fury that spoke to decades of accumulated wisdom and dignity. "I have spent 50 years in this business, treating people with respect, working with professionals who understand what it means to be decent human beings. What you've done tonight isn't professional, it isn't funny, and it sure as hell isn't entertainment." The studio audience sat in absolute stunned silence as they witnessed one of Hollywood's most respected figures unleash decades of pent-up frustration on a host who had clearly bitten off more than he could chew. Kimmel, for the first time since the interview began, appeared genuinely rattled as he faced the full force of Ford's legendary presence. The actor's imposing figure cast a shadow over the cowering host, who suddenly looked very small behind his desk. Ford's voice carried the weight of authority earned through decades of professionalism as he continued his devastating takedown. "You sit behind that desk night after night, hiding behind your writers and your audience, thinking that gives you the right to humiliate anyone who walks through that door. Well, let me tell you something, Jimmy. Respect isn't something you can fake, and dignity isn't something you can buy with ratings." Kimmel, desperate to regain some semblance of control over the rapidly deteriorating situation, attempted to play off the confrontation as part of the show's entertainment value. "Come on, Harrison, the audience is loving this. This is great television." His nervous laughter echoed through the studio, but the forced quality of his humor was painfully obvious to everyone present. The host's attempt to minimize the seriousness of the situation only served to further enrage the already furious actor. Ford's response was swift and brutal in its honesty. "Great television. Jimmy, what you've created here tonight is a masterclass in how to destroy your own credibility. You've shown everyone watching exactly who you really are. A small, insecure man who gets his kicks from trying to tear down people who are better than him. The words landed like physical blows, and Kimmel visibly recoiled as if he had been slapped. The host made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation by appealing to Ford's professionalism. "Look, Harrison, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over and talk about your new project?" But Ford was having none of it. The veteran actor's eyes burned with an intensity that spoke to a lifetime of dealing with Hollywood's worst behavior, and Kimmel's pathetic attempt at reconciliation only served to fuel his righteous anger. "Start over?" Ford's laugh was cold and bitter. "Jimmy, you don't get to spend 20 minutes systematically trying to destroy someone's dignity and then ask for a do-over. That's not how respect works. That's not how decent human beings behave." The actor's voice carried the weight of moral authority that comes from a lifetime of treating others with the respect that Kimmel had so obviously failed to show. The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point as Ford prepared to deliver what would prove to be the final nail in Kimmel's coffin. The veteran actor's posture straightened as he drew upon decades of experience dealing with Hollywood's worst excesses, and his voice carried the unmistakable tone of a man who had reached his absolute limit with unprofessional behavior. "You know what the really sad part is, Jimmy? You had the opportunity to interview one of the last connections to Hollywood's golden age, someone who worked with legends and helped create some of cinema's most beloved characters. Instead, you chose to use that opportunity to reveal yourself as nothing more than a playground bully with a television show." Ford's words were delivered with surgical precision, each syllable carefully chosen to expose the fundamental emptiness of Kimmel's approach to entertainment. Kimmel's face had gone pale as the full impact of Ford's words sank in. The host realized that he wasn't just being criticized by an angry guest. He was being systematically dismantled by a master of his craft who possessed the moral authority and professional standing to make such devastating observations stick. The power dynamic had completely shifted, and suddenly Kimmel found himself on the receiving end of a lesson in dignity and professionalism that he would never forget. As Ford gathered himself for what everyone sensed would be his final statement before leaving the stage, the studio held its collective breath, knowing they were about to witness the end of one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Ford straightened to his full height, his presence commanding absolute attention as he prepared to deliver his final verdict on Kimmel's behavior. The veteran actor's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of 5 decades in Hollywood and the moral authority of someone who had never compromised his principles for cheap laughs or easy ratings. "Jimmy, I've worked with directors who demanded excellence, co-stars who pushed me to be better, and crews who understood that respect is the foundation of any successful production. What you've demonstrated tonight is the complete opposite of everything I've learned about professionalism in this industry." Ford's words were measured and deliberate, each one landing with devastating impact on the increasingly desperate host. Kimmel made one last pathetic attempt to salvage the situation, his voice cracking with barely concealed panic. "Harrison, come on, we're both professionals here. Let's not let this get out of hand." But Ford's response was swift and merciless, cutting through Kimmel's plea like a sword through silk. "Professionals?" Ford's voice carried a note of incredulous disbelief. "Jimmy, professionals don't ambush their guests with personal attacks. Professionals don't use their platform to humiliate people who trusted them enough to appear on their show. Professionals understand that with great power comes great responsibility, and you've failed spectacularly on every count." The studio audience watched in stunned silence as Ford began to remove his microphone, the simple gesture carrying more dramatic weight than any scripted exit could have achieved. The veteran actor's movements were deliberate and dignified, each action a stark contrast to the undignified behavior he had been forced to endure from his host. "You know what the truly tragic part of all this is, Jimmy?" Ford paused in his movements, fixing Kimmel with one final withering stare. "You have a platform that reaches millions of people every night. You could use that influence to lift people up, to celebrate their achievements, to bring joy and laughter into their lives. Instead, you've chosen to use it as a weapon to tear people down for your own entertainment." Kimmel's face had turned an alarming shade of red as the full implications of Ford's words sank in. The host realized that he wasn't just losing control of a single interview. He was witnessing the systematic destruction of his credibility as a professional entertainer. Every word Ford spoke carried the ring of absolute truth, and there was no comeback, no witty retort that could undo the damage that had been done. Ford placed his microphone carefully on the arm of his chair, the small action somehow carrying more symbolic weight than any dramatic gesture could have achieved. "I came here tonight to talk about my work, to connect with your audience, to be part of something positive. What I found instead was a host more interested in cheap shots than genuine conversation, more concerned with his own ego than with treating his guests with basic human decency." The veteran actor began walking toward the exit, but stopped and turned back one final time, delivering what would prove to be the most devastating blow of the entire confrontation. "Jimmy, you've spent your entire career trying to be relevant, by association, bringing on guests who have actually accomplished something meaningful, and then attempting to diminish them to make yourself feel important. Tonight you've shown everyone exactly who you really are, and it's not pretty." Kimmel sat frozen behind his desk, completely unable to respond as Ford continued his methodical destruction of everything the host thought he represented. Real entertainers understand that their job is to serve their audience, not to use their guests as punching bags for their own insecurities. You've failed your audience, you've failed your guests, and most importantly, you've failed yourself. As Ford reached the edge of the stage, he delivered his final crushing verdict on Kimmel's behavior. "I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between entertainment and exploitation, between comedy and cruelty. What happened here tonight wasn't television. It was a public execution of basic human decency, and you were the executioner." The studio remained in absolute silence as Ford disappeared through the exit, leaving behind a host whose credibility lay in ruins and an audience that had witnessed one of the most spectacular professional meltdowns in television history. Kimmel sat alone at his desk, the weight of Ford's words hanging in the air like a toxic cloud that refused to dissipate. The show's producers scrambled to cut to commercial break, but the damage had already been done. Social media exploded within minutes as clips of the confrontation spread like wildfire across every platform. The hashtag #RespectHarrisonFord began trending worldwide as viewers expressed their outrage at Kimmel's treatment of the beloved actor. Entertainment. Industry veterans were quick to voice their support for Ford's dignified response to what many called the most unprofessional interview conduct they had ever witnessed. Major studios began distancing themselves from Kimmel's show, with several high-profile celebrities canceling their scheduled appearances in solidarity with Ford's position. The ratings' impact was immediate and devastating for Kimmel's show. Viewership plummeted as audiences rejected the host's brand of cruel entertainment, and advertisers began pulling their support en masse. What had started as what Kimmel thought would be an entertaining roasting of a Hollywood legend had instead become a masterclass in how to destroy one's own career through sheer unprofessionalism and lack of basic human decency. Ford's dramatic exit had exposed the ugly truth about a certain type of modern entertainment that prioritizes cruelty over comedy, ego over empathy, and ratings over respect. The veteran actor's principled stand had drawn a line in the sand, forcing everyone in the industry to choose between supporting dignity and professionalism, or enabling the kind of toxic behavior that Kimmel had displayed. In the end, Ford had done more than just walk off a talk show. He had delivered a powerful reminder that true professionals never compromise their principles, no matter how much pressure they face to accept unacceptable behavior.